So we've talked about Canada 1993, why a lot of people are looking at that and thinking, well, is the Tory party going to go the same way as the Conservative Party did in Canada? There are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of differences, but a lot of people have talked about it. And I think in some cases they are quite right to do so. Like I've said before in that video of, Canada 93, there are a lot of similarities. And I can understand why people are comparing it. But we also have to look at the UK and the UK general election of 1992, because 92 also has some implications that a lot of people seem to think of going on. Because I think you've got Labour going, we don't trust the polls. We do not trust that we have such a big poll lead. Could they be very wrong? If so, we are going to be very careful about it. And then you've got the Tories on the other side who are like, yeah, this could be 92 all over again. The pollsters have just got it completely all wrong. They're going to have absolute egg on the face. We are probably going to end up securing some sort of narrow victory. But in the end, who's right here? Are the polls actually generally correct when it's showing Labour's got still that massive 20-point lead over the Tories? Or is there something going on here? Is this generally a 1992 situation? I've said before, 92 should be something that we should look at and observe to see what went on there. Are there similarities? Could the same thing happen again? I hope not, but it's something that we should be very, very much aware of. So we're going to go have a look at that today. But before we do that, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And of course, as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel that way. So let's have a look over this in the Independent with this. Why the Tories think the polls have got Labour's lead wrong like they did in 92. An unpopular Conservative government, led by a recently installed Prime Minister, is about to be kicked out of office after more than a decade in power. And that is the overwhelming verdict of the polls. Almost every survey polls Labour in the lead, pointing to a wounding general election and a rebuff to a Tory administration that has piled up a huge majority last time around. Then the actual votes are counted, and something strange and totally unforeseen happens. The Conservatives have defied all predictions to pull out the most unlikely of victories. That may sound like a fantasy of one of today's Tories beleaguered politicians that might come up in the most optimistic of the dreams, but it is in fact a true story from 1992. And again, why we have to take 1992 seriously. Because that did happen. That was a thing. Not to think that 1992 could happen again is foolish. And it is something that we should be making sure that we don't fall into that same trap again. So, continues. John Major's win that year, with a majority of at least 21, was a genuine surprise because the opinion pollers got it so wrong. And now some in the Conservatives think that history could repeat itself. With Labour now apparently so far out in front, it seems an unlikely outcome. It would have to top even 1992's astonishing turnaround. Back then, the polls showed the Conservatives lagging an average of 1 percentage point behind throughout the campaign. Even the exit polls, conducted as electors leaving the polling stations, reached the same conclusion, that Labour was in front, if only by a narrow margin. And yet, on the 9th of April, the Conservative emerged 7.5% of Labour, securing a fourth consecutive spell in Downing Street. Their tally of almost 14.1 million votes remains the highest highest received by a single political party in UK history. Something also similar happened 23 years later. when the polls generally found the Tories and Labour were neck and neck in predicting that Britain was headed to another term of coalition government. Not a single survey forecast a Tory lead as big as 4.6 ahead, now achieved by David Cameron, as he won an unexpected majority in 2015. A total real belief now persists among the Tory ranks that the polls may have got it wrong again. So bear in mind, there is that belief in the Tory party that, hey, they've got it wrong. They got it wrong in 92. They got it wrong in 2015. And that's why I think Starmer is being so careful. Because you've got these two examples. And I think him, as we've said before, there is the before the general election, and then there's the general election itself. And general elections can be wild and crazy beasts because you never know what that general election is going to be about until you get there. Everyone thinks that the next general election is going to be about cost of living. That might very well turn out to be the case. But it might turn out to be an issue that randomly pops up just out of nowhere. Maybe Rishi takes a question wrong or something like that. Who knows? Could turn into something completely different. Remember, this happened to Theresa May. The 2017 general election, all meant to be about the Brexit election, didn't end up being about the Brexit at all. It ended up being about the pensioners' heating allowance election. As bizarre as that was, that's somehow how general elections can be. They are wild and crazy beasts, and you never know what they're going to be about until you actually start fighting the election. So this continues. So some of us are now doubting the methodology that they are using. One senior Tory source has said, in response to the Labour leads of more than 20 points, internal party polling shows that it is a lot closer with the red wall seats at about 10 points, and in some places we're only 5 points behind. The huge Labour by-election wins for Labour this month, overturning sizable Conservative majorities in Wellingborough and Kingswood, may not argue well for that scenario. But even these defeats can be accounted for under the more optimistic Tory outlooks. Michael Fabricant, a former Tory vice chairman, said to the Eye that the by-election results had made no difference to the Conservative changes of staying in government. Conservatives are staying at home at the moment, but we can win if we are seen to deliver, the MP said. The current Conservative Party chairman, Richard Holden, has also taken comfort from the very low turnout in the by-elections, as he said it is now his job to get his supporters enthused and ready to vote in a general election. So, is that the case? Do they really believe that that is just the case? That the reality is they're not turning out because there's nothing to vote for? I don't really see that. I think they're more staying away because a lot of Conservative voters have been so turned off by the state of the current party. They're staying away. It's not that they're not delivering or there's not anything to vote for or to be enthused about, because you've had such a long time in power. You've had a government since 2019, that has had such a sizable majority and done nothing with that majority. Haven't really delivered on any of their promises, their pledges. You know, last year alone, they only managed to pass 21 bills, which I think is the smallest amount of bills actually passed for a parliament. It's really shocking how little they actually managed to do last year. So, the by-election results were not good for Labour, another Tory MP said to the Eye. In Wellingborough, they got around 100 more than they did in 2019. Then they should be well way ahead. 2019 was a bad year. In Kingswood, there were about 5,000 less than 2019. If Starmer truly had momentum, those numbers would be huge. The Tories are not turning out. Even the country's most endangered Conservative MP, James Daly, who will be defending his hyper-marginal seat of Bury North, has declared that they are still all to play for. Underlying this suspicion amongst the Tories is that the gloomy national picture that the opinion polls have painted for them is now incorrect. Skeptics like Fabricant do not believe that they are capturing how people will vote in a general election in months' time, saying people will know it's a poll, not an actual election, he said. The pollsters are trying to compensate for that, but people like to work the polls by claiming they would vote one way in order to get their preferred party to behave differently. A former Tory cabinet minister said to the Eye that he believed that Labour support was wide but soft, and said, "We expect that lead to start to fade to about 10% or under or and to makes the election contest a shoe-in for Labour. But asking for your preference today is very different from how you're going to vote in 6 months' time." That is true. That's another thing why Labour should be, careful. That is true. You don't know how you're going to vote in, a couple of months' time. We are expecting, as we've said, the budget. That's the next big thing we're expecting. We'll see if that changes any fortunes around. I very much doubt it. Because we've had, Tories saying, "Oh, we're going to pass this budget and things are going to change. Our fortunes are going to reverse." I don't think so. If you talk to people, the genuine sense is they are just fed up of the Tory government. They just cannot stand these people being in power any longer. And I think that when it does come to the poll, or it does come to the poll time and a general election time, shall we say instead, that a lot of people are going to bear that in mind. A lot of people are going to bear that in mind. But anyway, let's finish this off. So the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, is providing a particular hope. A Tory source has privately said that polling has showed that he was not popular amongst voters and that the Labour Party scored weakly in favourability indices, a factor not caught in the current poll rating. Others point to the volatility of public opinion, saying, "I honestly believe that Labour are ahead in the polls," Conservative MP David Morris admitted. But the dynamic can move and shift, pointing to the move towards Cameron in 2015 and the massive swing away from Theresa May in an election just 2 years later. He argued that undecided ex-Tory voters could still return to the fold, saying what's coming through loud and clear is that there are about 30% of people who now are unsure for whatever reason, or how are they going to vote, he added. The Conservative High Command does think that Labour's recent travels, including the infighting triggered by the Rochdale by-election, the Rochdale by-election shambles, its U-turn over the £28 billion green investment plans could help. And more hope could come last week when all four polls found that Labour leads had dropped at least by 3 points. The Savanta survey showed that Labour's lead was falling by 7 points to 12 points, although Chris Hopkins, the company's recent research director, warned against reading too much into just a single poll. He has now cast doubt on the claim that 30% of voters are undecided, putting the figure at least closer to 12%, stressing that not all would eventually opt for the Tories. So, nevertheless, the triumph of 1992 is now in the Conservative strategist's mind, as they try to prepare for a campaign which will echo major warnings that the government led by Neil Kinnock would threaten the very tentative signs of economic recovery. But that argument would depend on interest rates and inflation falling in the coming months, and that voters can forget Liz Truss's catastrophic mini-budget. What's more, the Conservatives are in a far deeper polling hole than 32 years ago, trading much further behind than the opposition this time. Their current deficit raises the prospect and a return of a different election contest when Tony Blair scored a landslide triumph in 1997. So, again, all these different elections that we're looking back at, what is this going to be? Don't get me wrong, I think there is a lot of merit looking back at these different elections. But as we said, the 1997 election, the 1992 general election, the 2015 general election, the 2017 general election, all very, very different strange beasts, all preceded by very different things, just as it is being preceded by now. And we don't know when you get to a general election what that general election is going to be about, what are the main topics going to, what's going to come forward, how the main party is going to sort of put forward their messaging, etc., etc. There's going to be, I think, very, very much so, that is going to be what it depends on. And until we get a general election, we don't know. But Sunak is desperately hoping that, fingers crossed that this budget comes through and that somehow it manages to narrow the poll leads. Then I think eventually that's when they'll go to a general election. So, but what if the polls have really got it fundamentally wrong again, like they did in 1992? That year, an investigation into their failure concluded that around a quarter of the collective error was explained by Tory supporters refusing to reveal their allegiance to face-to-face or even telephone interviews. In addition, polling companies were judged to have used samples of the electorate in which Labour sympathisers were then overrepresented, a mistake that was repeated in 2015. And finally, the Conservatives benefited from a very late swing to them, which the surveys failed to capture. So, as you can see, maybe the pollsters do have it wrong. Maybe they do. We'll find out when the general election happens. The party will obviously do their best to achieve another late revival this time. But it is also possible that the Tory genuine supporters could once again be deceiving pollsters because they are shy about admitting their favour of such an unpopular party. Tim Bale, the professor of Queen Mary University of London, thinks not. He's now played down the theory that, quote, shy Tories are distorting the picture today, pointing to a critical change that polling companies have made since 1992, that many polls are now done online, and experts like Professor Bale believes that makes voters more likely to be truthful to them. The internet surveys are now so common these days that they are supposedly less vulnerable to societal desirable bias, which responds when respondents conceal their true opinion to a subject in order to make themselves look good to others, he said. Labour is confident and says that this private polling confirms it has built a healthy lead. It is clear that people are really fed up with the Tories, a source has said. It is also clear that people think that that we've changed and that we've got credit for that. However, the party refuses to put a number on its lead for fear of encouraging complacency among MPs, activists, and supporters. We treat it like we are level pegging, the source added. It is difficult because there are a lot of MPs who spend too much time abiding in polls. And again, I think that's a good tactic to go with. I think treat it as you are level pegging, because I think they are. Why are these polls putting us at such a high, rate? Is there something we should mistrust about this? Again, 1992, Neil Kinnock, the week before the general election, went out into Sheffield and delivered this monumental, almost victory speech, saying out how Labour was immediately about to win, how about they were going to go into government, it was going to be all this big change, and a week later he loses. I think it's good that they're being cautious, and at this point, and I think once you go into a general election, that's when you can sort of, start the, sound the charge, signal your, start, get ready at your starting line, and then off you go. You don't want to spend too much time sprinting before the actual race is meant to be run. And it is, I think, will all come down to the general election. So, Mr. Hopkins of Savanta does think there is some potential for Tory fortunes to improve, saying that we have had almost 2 years and seen a lot of movement away from the Conservative Party through Partygate, through Trussonomics, he said. If they can claw some of that back, there is a potential for the polls to narrow, but they still face a real uphill battle. He warns that the party is also struggling to reconnect with voters because of an inability to deliver on some of their policy pledges, a general fatigue and tiredness with the Conservative Party. there are also many things working against them, which leads me to assure that they will have everything they need to go right for them if to try and turn it around. The elections expert John Curtice, professor in politics at Strathclyde University, thinks the trajectory of the polls is closer to the run-up of the 1997 election, saying that the polls exaggerated Labour's position in 1997 as well as in 1992, he said. But with so large a lead this late in the parliament, even a reputation of previous poll errors would not be enough to close the gap. Professor Bale said who voters who were supported the Tories in previous elections were now on the fence because of the state of the economy, and that doesn't suggest that all will return to the home of the Conservative Party this year. This is neither 1992, not least because Sunak seems to offer a far less popular break with the previous regime than Major did, and not 1997 either, because Starmer isn't Blair, he concluded. But it is worth remembering that he doesn't need to be Blair to win. Labour could do it by just not being the Conservatives. So, once again, people talking about the different general elections, how these things have shaped a general election, in the run up to a general election, how this goes. And like I say, at the moment, we know there's going to be a general election this year. We just don't know when. I think there's a lot of people saying May, and I think there's a hope in some way that this upcoming budget maybe narrows the polls. But once again, they did this last year when Rishi Sunak came in and Hunt delivered this what was meant to this spectacular budget. It didn't really help in the polls back then. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, but it will all come down, I think, to a general election. And I think that they are right in many cases to be skeptical of the polls, not to become overly too confident of this poll lead. Like we've said there, polls got it wrong. And when it comes to a general election, you don't know what will happen. If you've been sprinting that much before the race starts, when you actually get to run the race, you're going to have problems. You might run out of steam during the actual race itself, which is, I think, probably what they are worried about. So we'll see what happens when we go from here. But like I say, all comes down to what happens in the general election. So until then, as always, we'll see you all next time.